Welcome to the next installment in my video lecture series in economics. And in this particular video lecture series, I'm going to be taking a look at market equilibrium, excess supply, and excess demand. And it's important, this particular section, because much of the analysis that's going to go forward, we're going to be talking about market equilibrium or moving to market equilibrium, etc. So understanding what an equilibrium is and why a market has a tendency to move towards equilibrium, it is going to be very important, not only for this particular section, but for future sections moving forward. So make sure you're comfortable with the concept of a market equilibrium and why we have a tendency to move towards equilibrium in markets. As always, I try to give appropriate attribution for any citations I use in the particular video. So this is the citation for the book that's used for anything that is presented in quotes during this particular video lecture. As always, we need to have a few terms straight in our heads before we move forward. We need to know exactly what an equilibrium is, and an equilibrium is the condition that exists when quantity supplied and quantity demanded are equal. At equilibrium, there is no tendency for price to change. So remember that. Equilibrium is where, at a particular price, where the quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal to one another. And when we reach an equilibrium, there's no tendency for price to change. Now, there may be some external factors that occur in a market that can shift the supply and the demand curve and change the equilibrium price and quantity, but we'll move to that analysis a little bit later. Also, we're going to be talking about excess demand, also known as shortage, so I use these terms interchangeably, so realize that excess demand and shortage are the same thing, and that is the condition that exists when quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied at the current price. So this is not the equilibrium price. It is a price where the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. And also we'll be talking about excess supply. And this is equivalent to surplus. These terms are used interchangeably, so make sure you realize that surplus and excess supply are the same thing. And excess supply or surplus is the condition that exists when quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded at their current prices, at the current price. So we are going to look at the equilibrium. The first thing to realize is when we talk about equilibrium that you have to have a supply and a demand curve. All right, if you do an analysis of equilibrium and you only have a demand curve or you only have a supply curve, that is inappropriate. You're not analyzing the equilibrium in a marketplace. And as a reminder, equilibrium is a condition that exists when quantity supplied and quantity demanded are equal. So we have our downward sloping demand curve. Reason why the demand curve is downward sloping is because of the law of supply and the law of the law of demand, and the law of demand states that there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, hence we have a downward sloping demand curve. And for the supply curve, it is upward sloping because of the law of supply, which states that there is a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. So the demand curve is downward sloping and the supply curve is upward sloping. So in order to get the equilibrium, we need to get the price where quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal to one another. This occurs where the supply and demand curves intersect one another. At this intersection point, this gives us the equilibrium quantity, and that in turn gives us the equilibrium price. So when you're doing any type of graphical analysis, just remember that the equilibrium occurs where the supply and demand curves intersect one another, and that equilibrium quantity is where the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied are equal to one another. Now, we may have a situation where the equilibrium price is not occurring in the market. We want to see how that impacts the market. So excess demand or shortage is the condition that exists when quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied at the current price. And that only occurs below the equilibrium price. So any price below the equilibrium price, we are going to experience excess demand or shortage. So I can draw in any price that's below the equilibrium price. And what you can do is you go from that price and you move across until you hit the first curve, which is the supply curve. So that tells us the quantity supplied. And we also want to know what the quantity demanded is. So at that price, we continue along until we hit the demand curve, and that tells us quantity demanded. So at this price, we can see that quantity demanded is excess or exceeds the quantity supplied. So that amount at that price is the excess demand or the shortage, and it's equivalent to quantity demanded less quantity supplied. So at that particular price, people, let's say, want to purchase 10,000 units of soybeans in a particular year, but soybean farmers only want to produce 1,000 units. So the quantity demanded is equal to 10,000, the quantity supplied is equal to 1,000. That means the excess demand or the shortage is equal to 9,000 units. Additionally, we want to know what excess supply is, and again, the definition for excess supply or surplus is the condition that exists when quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded at current prices. And for this to occur, the price has to be above the equilibrium price. So I can draw in a price above the equilibrium price, and the first curve I hit is the demand curve. So that relationship between price and demand gives us quantity demanded. And if we continue along that price until we hit the supply curve and go straight down, that gives us quantity supplied. So you can see at this price above the equilibrium gives us a situation where the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. So if I take quantity supplied and subtract quantity demanded at that price, that gives me the excess supply or the surplus. And it's important to realize that under these different scenarios where we're not at equilibrium, why are we going to move towards the equilibrium? So for example, in this case, let's put yourself in this position of the supplier. You're producing a product and selling it at a particular price, and you want to sell, let's say, 10,000 units in a particular time period, and individuals only want to buy 1,000. So you've got 9,000 units lying around that nobody wants to buy at that price. So the tendency is going to be for the price to lower, because when you lower the price, the quantity, you're going to supply less, but people are going to demand more. So the quantity supplied is going to decrease and the quantity demanded is going to increase. And that price will continue to migrate downward until it gets to the equilibrium where quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal to one another. So I have this slightly, I guess I lowered the opacity on this so it wasn't quite as obvious. The price is going to keep decreasing until we get to the equilibrium price, the equilibrium price. And at that equilibrium price, you're going to supply exactly what people want to buy, the amounts people want to buy at that price. So there's no tendency to move towards that. So let's say we migrate down to this equilibrium price. There's no incentive to raise the price, because if you raise the price, you're going to have a surplus. And if you lower the price, you're going to have a shortage. So then you're going to just migrate back towards that equilibrium price. So make sure you're comfortable with this analysis. I said that many things that we do moving forward in the course will build off of this. So if you don't have a strong understanding of an equilibrium, what is an equilibrium, what is excess supply or surplus, what is excess demand or shortage, if you have difficulties with that, that just means you're going to have difficulties moving forward in this course.